November 1943, somewhere in the vast waters of the Central Pacific, 400 feet beneath the surface. Commander Howard Williams gripped the periscope housing as his submarine descended into depths that every naval manual declared suicidal for combat operations. The hull groaned under pressure that would have crushed vessels just 5 years earlier, and his crew of 73 men breathed recycled air that grew thinner with each passing minute. Above them, completely unaware of the predator lurking in the abyss, a Japanese convoy of 12 merchant ships and 4 escort destroyers cut through waters they believed utterly secure. The Imperial Japanese Navy had calculated everything. Their depth charges were calibrated for attacks at 200 feet or less. Their sonar operators trained to detect submarines at conventional operating depths. Their convoy routes planned around the assumption that American submarines could never strike from the crushing darkness below 300 feet. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong those calculations had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the following 18 months would transform the Pacific conflict in ways that historians are still measuring today. A technological revolution in American submarine design, combined with audacious tactics that Japanese strategists never anticipated, would sever the maritime lifelines of an island nation and bring one of the most powerful fleets in history to its knees. This is the story of how American submarines learned to hunt from impossible depths, and how that single innovation changed the course of the entire Pacific theater. The story begins not in the ocean depths, but in the shipyards of Portsmouth, New Hampshire and Groton, Connecticut, where a new generation of submarines was taking shape in 1941. Naval architect Andrew McKenna had spent 15 years studying the limitations of submarine warfare, and he understood that depth meant survival. The deeper a submarine could operate, the harder it became to detect, and the more impossible it became to destroy. But depth also meant pressure, and pressure meant death if the hull could not withstand it. McKenna gathered his team of 12 engineers in a cramped office overlooking the construction yards on a February morning in 1941. Snow fell outside as he spread blueprints across the table. These men would spend the next 18 months solving problems that conventional naval engineering considered unsolvable. They would use a new high-tensile steel alloy that could withstand pressures exceeding 400 pounds per square inch. They would redesign hull geometries to distribute stress more efficiently. They would create new welding techniques that eliminated the weak points that had doomed earlier deep-diving attempts. The result was the Balao-class submarine, and the numbers told the story of a quantum leap in capability. Test depth was officially rated at 400 feet, but the boats were actually built to withstand descents to 600 feet or more. The previous Gato-class submarines had been rated at 300 feet test depth. This represented a 33% increase in operational capability, but the tactical implications were far greater than that percentage suggested. It meant American submarines could operate in an entirely different domain of the ocean, one that Japanese anti-submarine forces were simply not equipped to reach. Lieutenant Commander Richard Foster took command of one of the first Balao-class submarines, the USS Seahorse, in March 1943. Foster was 34 years old, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1931, and he had already completed 2 war patrols in older submarines. He understood both the potential and the risks of the new boats. During his first week aboard, he gathered his officers in the wardroom and laid out his philosophy. "We have a weapon they do not understand," Foster told his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Dawson. "Every foot of depth we can use is a foot of safety they cannot reach. We will train to fight from 400 feet. We will train until the crew trusts this boat more than they trust the surface." The training was brutal. Foster took the Seahorse to her test depth 17 times during workup exercises off the California coast. Each dive pushed the crew through the psychological barrier of descending into crushing darkness. They learned to trust the hull as it groaned and flexed. They learned to trust the instruments as pressure mounted. They learned to trust each other in conditions where a single mistake meant death for everyone aboard. Torpedo Man Second Class. James McCarthy later recalled those training dives in letters to his wife in Boston. The first time we went below 300 feet, he wrote, half the crew was convinced we would never see daylight again. The boat makes sounds down there that no submarine is supposed to make. But by the 10th dive, we were playing cards at 400 feet like it was nothing. Commander Foster knew what he was doing. He was teaching us to be comfortable in a place where the enemy could never follow. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy was planning convoy routes with supreme confidence in their anti-submarine doctrine. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita briefed merchant marine commanders in April 1943 with statistics that seemed to guarantee safety. Japanese depth charges were effective to a maximum depth of 250 feet. Their sonar could reliably detect submarines operating above 200 feet. Convoys that maintained proper formation and escort discipline had suffered losses of less than 3% over the previous 6 months. What Kurita did not know, and could not have known, was that American submarines were about to render every one of those statistics meaningless. The USS Seahorse departed Pearl Harbor on her third war patrol on September 15, 1943, with orders to interdict shipping in the East China Sea. Foster had 73 men aboard, 24 torpedoes, and a boat that could operate in depths the Japanese had never trained to counter. The patrol would last 52 days and cover over 11,000 nautical miles. It would also demonstrate tactics that would eventually strangle the Japanese merchant fleet. The first contact came on September 28th. Radar operator, Seaman First Class William Torres, detected a convoy at 22,000 yards just after midnight. The convoy consisted of 6 merchant ships carrying iron ore from the Philippines to Japan, escorted by 2 destroyers and 1 patrol craft. Foster studied the radar plot and made his decision. "We will attack submerged at periscope depth for initial targeting," he told his officers. "But we will fire from 350 feet and go deep to 400 immediately after. They cannot follow us there." The approach took 4 hours. Foster maneuvered the Seahorse into position ahead of the convoy, then dove to periscope depth for final targeting. At 0417, he raised the attack periscope for exactly 11 seconds, long enough to calculate the firing solution for the leading merchant ship, a freighter of approximately 8,000 tons. He called out the bearing, range, and angle on the bow, then gave the order to fire. 4 torpedoes left the tubes in a spread designed to bracket the target. Foster immediately ordered the boat down. "Take her to 400 feet, he commanded, "all ahead full. Rig for depth charge." The Seahorse descended into the darkness as the torpedoes ran toward their target. At 312 feet, the crew heard 2 explosions as torpedoes struck the freighter. Then came the sound they dreaded, the high-speed propellers of a destroyer turning toward them. Sonar operator Chief Petty Officer Daniel Morrison called out the contact. "Destroyer closing, bearing 045, range 3,000 yards and decreasing." The destroyer passed overhead at 320 feet. And the depth charges began to fall. The first pattern of 6 charges detonated at 150 feet, far above the Seahorse. The explosions were audible but distant, like thunder from a storm on the horizon. The second pattern detonated at 200 feet, still too shallow to threaten the submarine. The destroyer made 3 more passes over the following hour, dropping a total of 36 depth charges. Not one detonated below 250 feet. Commander Foster kept the Seahorse at 400 feet for 6 hours as the destroyers searched overhead. The crew sat in near-total silence, breathing carefully to conserve oxygen, sweating in the tropical heat that the air conditioning could not fully counter at that depth. But they were alive. And the Japanese had no way to reach them. When the Seahorse finally surfaced that evening, Foster assessed the results. 1 freighter confirmed sunk, 36 depth charges expended by the enemy, 0 damage to the submarine. The mathematics of this exchange would define the rest of the Pacific conflict. American submarines could strike and then descend to depths where Japanese countermeasures were useless. Each attack would cost Japan ships it could not replace, while the submarines remained essentially invulnerable. The tactical reports from the Seahorse and other Ballo-class submarines reached the desk of Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor. Lockwood commanded the Pacific Submarine Force, and he immediately recognized the strategic implications of deep-diving attacks. He issued new tactical doctrine in November 1943, that formalized what Foster and others had discovered through combat experience. The new doctrine was simple but revolutionary. American submarines would make their attacks from depths of 300 feet or greater, whenever possible. They would use their superior diving capability to negate Japanese anti-submarine weapons. They would treat depth as their primary defensive advantage. The Japanese had built their entire anti-submarine warfare around the assumption that submarines operated near the surface. That assumption was now obsolete. The impact on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. In 1942, Japanese anti-submarine forces had sunk 20 American submarines while losing approximately 600,000 tons of merchant shipping. In 1944, as the deep diving tactics became standard, Japanese anti-submarine forces would sink only 19 American submarines, while losing over 2,700,000 tons of shipping. The exchange rate had shifted by more than 400% in favor of American submarines. Japanese commanders began to notice the change in early 1944. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding a destroyer escort group, reported to Tokyo that American submarines were consistently escaping to depths beyond the effective range of depth charges. He recommended developing weapons capable of reaching 400 feet or more. His recommendation was noted but never implemented. Japanese industry was already strained beyond capacity producing aircraft and surface ships. There were no resources available to develop entirely new anti-submarine weapons. The desperation in Japanese convoy operations grew through the spring of 1944. Escort commanders began dropping depth charges at random intervals, hoping to deter submarines by creating a constant threat. They increased the size of their patterns, expending hundreds of charges on each suspected contact. They added more escorts to each convoy, sometimes assigning one destroyer for every 2 merchant ships. None of these measures addressed the fundamental problem. Japanese depth charges simply could not reach the depths where American submarines were operating. Lieutenant Commander Slade Cutter, commanding the USS Seahorse after Foster transferred to a new construction command, became one of the most successful practitioners of deep diving tactics. On his 4th war patrol in April 1944, Cutter sank 4 ships totaling 19,000 tons while operating almost exclusively below 300 feet. His patrol report noted that Japanese escorts dropped over 200 depth charges during the patrol without causing any damage to the submarine. "The depth charges invariably detonated above us," Cutter wrote. "The enemy has no weapon that can reach our operating depth. We have essentially achieved immunity from their countermeasures." This immunity transformed the psychology of submarine warfare. Earlier in the conflict, submarine crews had feared depth charging as one of the most terrifying experiences in combat. The explosions were violent and disorienting. The uncertainty of whether the next charge would be the one to rupture the hull created intense psychological pressure. But the deep-diving submarines changed that calculus. Crews learned that if they could reach 400 feet quickly enough, they would be safe. The fear diminished, confidence increased. Submarine commanders became more aggressive because they knew they could escape. Commander Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb exemplified this new aggressive spirit. Fluckey conducted some of the most audacious attacks of the conflict, including surface gun actions against shore installations, because he knew he could always escape by diving deep if enemy forces responded. His 5th war patrol in the summer of 1944 destroyed 17 ships totaling over 95,000 tons. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for this patrol, but he credited his success to the boat itself. The Barb could go places and do things that would have been suicide in an older submarine, he later wrote. The aggregate statistics told the story of strategic catastrophe for Japan. In 1941, Japan possessed merchant shipping totaling approximately 6 million tons. By the end of 1944, American submarines had sent over 4 million tons to the bottom. The Japanese shipbuilding industry could replace only about 1,700,000 tons per year. The arithmetic was remorseless. Japan was losing ships faster than it could build them, and the rate of loss was accelerating. The impact on Japan's war economy was devastating. Iron ore shipments from the Philippines and Malaya fell by 60%. Oil tanker losses meant that fuel supplies in Japan proper dropped to critical levels. Food imports from Korea and Manchuria declined to the point where civilian rations had to be cut repeatedly. Japanese industrial production, which depended on imported raw materials, began to decline even as American production reached its wartime peak. Japanese naval intelligence finally grasped the scope of the disaster in the summer of 1944. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was assigned to study the shipping losses and recommend countermeasures. His report to the Naval General Staff in August was blunt. American submarines had achieved a tactical advantage that Japanese forces could not counter with existing weapons. The only effective response would be to develop depth charges capable of reaching 500 feet and sonar systems capable of tracking submarines at extreme depths. The Naval General Staff received Fuchida's report but had no means to implement his recommendations. Japan's industrial capacity was already fully committed to producing aircraft for homeland defense and warships for the decisive surface battle that naval strategists still believed would come. There were no factories available to produce new anti-submarine weapons. There were no engineers available to design them. There was no steel available to build them. Japan would face the American submarine offensive with the same weapons it had possessed in 1941. The most dramatic demonstration of deep-diving tactics came in November 1944 during the Philippine Sea campaign. A convoy of 12 transports carrying reinforcements to the Philippines was attacked by 3 American submarines operating in a coordinated wolf pack. The submarines were the USS Queenfish, USS Barb, and USS Pacuda. They attacked from the north, south, and west simultaneously, creating chaos among the escorts. Commander Charles Laughlin of the Queenfish coordinated the attack. His plan called for each submarine to fire torpedoes from periscope depth, then immediately dive to 400 feet and clear the area at high speed. The escorts would be forced to choose which submarine to pursue, allowing the other 2 to escape easily. The attack lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, 7 of the 12 transports had been hit. 5 sank within hours. The remaining 2 reached Manila with such severe damage that they were never returned to service. The 3 submarines escaped without damage, despite facing 8 destroyers and numerous depth charge attacks. Not one depth charge detonated below 280 feet. This single engagement demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of Japanese anti-submarine doctrine. Even when escorts knew exactly where the submarines were and responded immediately, they could not prevent the submarines from escaping to safe depths. The American submarines had turned the ocean itself into a sanctuary that Japanese weapons could not penetrate. By early 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic asset. Oil imports had fallen by 95% from pre-war levels, food imports by 80%, raw material imports by 70%. Japanese factories stood idle for lack of materials. Japanese aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Japanese civilians faced mounting hunger as the home islands were cut off from the resources of the empire. Admiral Lockwood later estimated that American submarines sank over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping during the conflict, approximately 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. These submarines achieved this destruction while losing only 52 boats, a loss rate of less than 15%. The deep-diving capability of the Balao class had been central to this favorable exchange rate. Submarines that could operate at 400 feet were simply not vulnerable to Japanese countermeasures. The human stories behind these statistics were equally remarkable. Thousands of American submariners served in conditions of extreme danger and discomfort, spending weeks underwater, breathing recycled air, eating canned food, sleeping in bunks stacked 4 high. They faced the constant knowledge that a single mechanical failure or tactical error could send them to the bottom. Yet they continued to volunteer for submarine duty throughout the conflict because they knew their boats gave them a decisive advantage over the enemy. Chief Motor Machinist's mate Robert Peterson served on 3 Balao-class submarines and completed 8 war patrols. He later described the confidence that deep-diving capability gave the crew. When you know you can go deeper than they can reach, he explained, you stop worrying about depth charges. You focus on the attack. You focus on getting your torpedoes into the target. The boat will protect you. You just have to trust her. That trust was built on engineering excellence and rigorous training. Every Palau-class submarine underwent extensive testing before commissioning, including multiple dives to test depth. Every crew trained for weeks before their first war patrol, practicing emergency procedures at depths that would have been unthinkable in earlier submarines. This combination of superior technology and thorough preparation created the most effective submarine force the world had ever seen. The Japanese Navy never developed an effective counter to deep-diving submarines. They proposed aircraft-dropped depth charges with delayed fusing to reach greater depths, but these were never produced in quantity. They experimented with magnetic detection equipment to locate submarines at extreme depth, but the technology remained unreliable. They even considered using submarines of their own to hunt American submarines at depth. But Japanese submarines were designed for different missions and could not match American diving performance. The failure to counter American submarines represented one of the most consequential strategic errors of the Pacific conflict. Japan had built its empire on sea power and maritime trade. Every island in the Pacific defense perimeter depended on shipping to sustain its garrison. The home islands themselves imported virtually all their oil, most of their iron ore, and significant portions of their food. When American submarines severed these maritime lifelines, the empire began to collapse from within. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Navy minister in the final years of the conflict, later acknowledged the devastating impact of submarine warfare. "We knew we were losing ships," he said, "but we did not understand the cumulative effect until it was too late. By the time we recognized that American submarines were strangling our economy, we had no means to stop them. They operated in depths we could not reach with weapons we could not build." The final reckoning came in the summer of 1945. Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced from 6 million tons to less than 1 million operational tons. Oil reserves were virtually exhausted. Food supplies were critically low. Industrial production had collapsed. American submarines had played a decisive role in creating these conditions, and their deep-diving capability had been essential to their survival and effectiveness. Commander Howard Williams, whose dive to 400 feet had opened this account, survived the conflict and returned to civilian life in 1946. He settled in San Diego and worked as a marine engineer for 30 years. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, but he kept a photograph of the USS Seahorse in his office until his death in 1989. When asked about the submarine by younger colleagues, he would say only that she was a good boat that took care of her crew. The technology that Williams and his fellow submariners pioneered became the foundation for all subsequent submarine development. The nuclear submarines of the Cold War operated at even greater depths, building on the engineering principles established in the Palau class. The understanding that depth meant survival and tactical advantage remained central to submarine doctrine. The lessons learned in the Pacific had permanent impact on naval warfare. The Japanese naval personnel who survived the conflict came to appreciate the significance of what they had faced. Captain Hara, who had commanded anti-submarine escorts, became a naval historian after the war. He wrote extensively about the failure of Japanese anti-submarine warfare and identified the depth charge limitation as the fundamental problem. "We were fighting an enemy we could not reach," he wrote. "Our weapons were designed for a type of submarine that no longer existed. The Americans had changed the rules of the game, and we never adapted." The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate military situation. The strangulation of Japanese shipping demonstrated that island nations were uniquely vulnerable to submarine blockade. This lesson influenced post-war naval planning for decades. It contributed to the emphasis on anti-submarine warfare in Cold War navies. It shaped the design of merchant ships and the organization of convoy systems. The Pacific submarine campaign became a case study in the effectiveness of economic warfare conducted through maritime interdiction. The men who served in American submarines paid a significant price for their successes. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American armed forces, with approximately 20% of submarine sailors losing their lives during the conflict. Yet they also achieved results out of all proportion to their numbers. Submarines represented less than 2% of American naval personnel, but accounted for 55% of Japanese shipping losses. This effectiveness ratio was unprecedented in naval history. The deep-diving capability that made this effectiveness possible represented a triumph of American industrial and engineering prowess. The ability to design, build, and deploy submarines that could operate at 400 feet demonstrated the strength of the American manufacturing base. Japanese submarines, designed for fleet operations and commerce raiding rather than survival, could not match this capability. The technological gap in submarine design both symbolized and contributed to the larger material superiority that determined the outcome of the Pacific conflict. As the conflict ended and the full scope of the submarine campaign became clear, naval historians began to recognize its significance. The strangulation of Japanese shipping had been as important as any fleet action in determining the outcome. The deep-diving tactics that enabled American submarines to survive and continue their attacks had been essential to this strangulation. A single engineering innovation, the ability to operate at 400 feet, had contributed to the defeat of one of the most powerful navies the world had ever seen. The waters of the Pacific have long since returned to peace. The convoys no longer sail, the submarines no longer hunt. But the legacy of those desperate years remains embedded in naval thinking and submarine technology around the world. The men who served in the Palau-class submarines demonstrated that depth was the key to submarine survival and effectiveness. They proved that a submarine which could dive deeper than the enemy could reach was nearly invulnerable. They showed that this invulnerability could be translated into strategic results that shaped the outcome of the largest maritime conflict in history. Commander Williams and his crew dove to 400 feet in November 1943, believing that their depth would protect them from Japanese countermeasures. They were correct. That protection extended to hundreds of other submarines and thousands of other sailors over the following 2 years. It enabled the most effective submarine campaign in naval history. It severed the lifelines of an empire. It demonstrated that engineering innovation could be as decisive as courage or numbers in determining the outcome of warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy had calculated that American submarines would operate at conventional depths and remain vulnerable to conventional countermeasures. They built their entire anti-submarine doctrine around this calculation. They were wrong by 150 feet, and that margin of error contributed to the loss of over 5 million tons of shipping and the collapse of their maritime empire. Rarely in military history has a single technical specification had such profound strategic consequences. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.